Welcome to Church History Stories, where I explore fascinating and sometimes controversial topics from the history of the Church. In continuing with the theme of heresies that I've been working through, I'm diving into the story of Pelagius, whose teachings became one of the most persistent heresies to corrupt the gospel of salvation by grace. Born in the British Isles in the mid-4th century, Pelagius was a devout Christian monk who took seriously the most rigorous demands of the Christian life. Unlike many church fathers who came from wealthy or noble backgrounds, Pelagius emerged from the ascetic movement that was sweeping through Christianity at the time. He received an excellent education, mastering both Latin and Greek, a rare accomplishment for someone from the edges of the Roman world. Around 385, Pelagius made the fateful decision to travel to Rome. The Rome he encountered was far different from the austere environment of British monasticism. The empire's capital had transformed dramatically in recent decades. Christianity had become the favored religion, leading to a flood of converts who had little interest in genuine spiritual transformation. The church faced a serious problem. There were simply too many people requesting baptism to maintain the traditional requirement of 2 or 3 years of preparation as catechumens. What Pelagius found in Rome deeply troubled him. Many Christians, particularly among the upper classes, lived lives virtually unchanged from their pagan days. When confronted about their sinful behavior, they would simply shrug it off, claiming they were only human. This casual attitude towards sin sparked in Pelagius a reforming zeal that would eventually lead him far beyond orthodox Christian teaching. Despite not being ordained as a priest, Pelagius established himself as a spiritual advisor to wealthy Roman families. His emphasis on moral reform and strict discipline attracted many followers, especially among the Roman aristocracy. Around 405, he wrote a commentary on Paul's epistles that first revealed some of his problematic theological ideas. In this work, he took particular issue with anything that seemed to excuse human sinfulness or suggest that people couldn't help but sin. Pelagius's life in Rome brought him into contact with some of the most important Christian thinkers of his day. He knew Jerome, who would later become one of his fierce opponents. He was familiar with the early writings of Augustine, particularly Augustine's work On Free Will, which contained ideas Pelagius would later cite in support of his own views. However, he failed to notice that Augustine's thinking was already moving in a very different direction. When Rome fell to the Goths under Alaric in 409, Pelagius fled the city, along with many other Roman Christians. He travelled first to Sicily and then to Carthage in North Africa. His follower Celestius accompanied him to Carthage, but remained there when Pelagius continued on to Jerusalem. This geographic split would prove significant. While Pelagius found some support in the east, Celestius's more direct presentation of their shared ideas quickly sparked controversy in North Africa. In Jerusalem, Pelagius initially found a more welcoming environment. He successfully defended himself at church councils in Jerusalem and Diospolis in 415. He even gained the temporary support of Pope Zosimus, to whom he presented a carefully worded statement of faith in 417. However, protests from the North African bishops and pressure from Emperor Honorius eventually turned Rome against him. The final phase of Pelagius's life remains somewhat mysterious. After being condemned by several church councils and forced to leave Palestine, he likely died in Egypt sometime after 418. His personal demise, however, didn't end the influence of his ideas. One of his followers, Julian of Eclanum, would continue promoting and developing Pelagian teachings, leading to a second phase of controversy that would last until 431. Throughout this period, Pelagius maintained that he was simply trying to promote genuine Christian living and moral reform. However, in his zeal to combat moral laxity, he developed teachings that struck at the very heart of the Christian understanding of sin, grace, and salvation. His story serves as a warning about how attempts to solve real problems in the church can lead to dangerous distortions of biblical truth if not grounded in sound theology. The theological controversy that bears Pelagius's name centered on fundamental questions about human nature and salvation. At its core was a debate about what happened in the Garden of Eden. Did Adam's sin affect only himself, or did it fundamentally alter human nature? Pelagius developed his views partly in reaction to Manichaeanism, a dualistic religion that treated evil as an independent principle and viewed sin as a natural necessity. Against this physical determinism, He emphasized human freedom and God's grace in creation. He argued that God had given everyone the natural ability to avoid sin and choose good, though this ability had been somewhat darkened by Adam's poor example. When challenged about his views on sin, Pelagius would often quote Jesus' words, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." He insisted this command proved that perfection must be possible through human effort. He was particularly disturbed by Augustine's prayer in the Confessions. "Give me what thou enjoinest, and enjoin what thou wilt." To Pelagius, this sounded like an excuse for moral failure. The arrival of Celestius in Carthage brought these theological issues to the forefront. Celestius taught explicitly what Pelagius had sometimes implied. Adam was created mortal, his sin affected only himself, and children are born in the same state Adam was before the fall. This raised serious questions about infant baptism. If infants weren't born with original sin, why did they need baptism? The Church had long practiced infant baptism, but now its theological foundation was being questioned. Augustine's response to Pelagianism developed in several stages. In his earlier writings, like On Free Will, he had emphasized human choice. But by 396, his focus had shifted to the corruption of human nature and the necessity of divine grace. The key text for Augustine became Romans 5, where Paul speaks of sin entering the world through one man and death through sin. Augustine developed a comprehensive understanding of original sin. He argued that Adam's sin fundamentally altered human nature, leaving us with disordered passions that we pass on to our children. The mind itself is affected, making us unable to think clearly about spiritual things or choose what is truly good. This is what Augustine meant by total depravity. Not that everything we do is completely evil, but that every part of our nature is tainted by self-interest and pride. This led to Augustine's doctrine of irresistible grace. If our minds are so clouded by sin that we cannot see the gospel clearly, then we cannot choose it for what it is. God must first work in us, giving us the ability to understand and believe. This grace comes to us not because of any good in us, but solely because of God's sovereign choice, what Augustine called unconditional election. The monks of southern France, particularly around Marseille, found Augustine's teachings troubling. They attempted a middle way that became known as semi-Pelagianism. They agreed that grace was necessary, but argued that humans retained enough spiritual ability to take the first step toward God. Their leader, John Cassian, taught that God's predestination was based on his foreknowledge of who would choose him. The Church addressed these issues at the Synod of Orange in 529. This council affirmed that humans are born with total depravity and cannot take the first step toward God. However, it also taught that at baptism, sufficient grace is given to allow us to choose by our own will. This somewhat ambiguous compromise became the standard position of the medieval Church. These debates have continued to shape Christian theology. The Reformation brought renewed attention to Augustine's teachings on grace and predestination. Modern evangelical debates about free will and predestination often echo arguments from the Pelagian controversy. Even today, many Christians unconsciously hold semi-Pelagian views, believing they can take the first step towards God on their own. If you want more videos exploring fascinating controversies from church history, please like, share, and subscribe for more church history stories. Cheers.